teacher, and there's a very telling statement at the end of each of those chapters in the Bible. You understand, I'm not talking about chapter Bibles, I'm talking about episodes or story chapters in the story. At the end of the creation story, it says, and they were naked and not ashamed. And at the end of the second chapter, it says, and they realized they were naked, and they sewed themselves clothes for their waist out of fig leaves. So what's the change? The change is that there was no need for any division between people and humans and God at the end of the creation chapter. But by the end of the second chapter, all of that was broken. And suddenly they hide from God, and they hide from one another, and they're ashamed. And so we come to chapter 3, where God is going to rescue. God's starting the rescue mission to restore humanity and indeed all of creation back to the original sense of community. In fact, when we get to the end, we'll discover that it's even better than it was at the beginning. But that's for a couple of episodes away, a couple of chapters away. And so now, if I were going to launch a rescue mission for the human race, I would be looking for someone who had power, someone who had influence, someone who had some money to do some real work along these lines. I would look for a specific type of powerful, popular influencer who was still faithful to God. But God doesn't operate the way I operate. And you should be thankful for that. God searched around and found this old geriatric, shriveled up dude in the middle of the desert in what would be modern day Kuwait or that general area. He was in his mid-70s. His wife was old, had gone through menopause, and she was a shriveled up old lady. And God said to these card-carrying AARP people, go take a trip. You know, AAR people like to take trips. And so go take a trip. Sure, where? Oh, I'll show you someday. Just go take a trip. We're going to rescue the world. And they were crazy enough to do it. And so they pick up and they leave, and as they go their way, God says to Abram, his name was Abram at the time, and he changed his name eventually to Abraham, and Sarah was Sarai at the beginning of the story, and he changed it, and there's lots of good reasons for that, and it's a cool part of the story, but I'm not getting into it today for time's sake. And they go, and God says, I'm going to bless all the nations through your descendants. Now, not only are these two people old, they don't have any kids. You'd think God could do better than that, wouldn't you? Here are these two old people who don't have kids, and God's saying, oh, through your kids, the whole world's going to be blessed. Right off the bat in this rescue story, I discover that God's ways are not my ways. God does things differently. We look for, if we want something changed, we look for something to be changed by someone who is powerful or wealthy or well-respected, not some unknown person from the backside of the desert who is old and used up. But God doesn't do it the way we do. Also, if we want something changed, I remember someone was really angry at me about 6 months in, about Christmas time, the first year I was here, because I hadn't turned around the church and doubled the attendance in 6 months. And they were really mad, because that's the way we tend to think. I mean, I get where they're coming from. We want it, and we want it now. We want to see some change now. Have you ever noticed how when a politician's doing something and they lay out this plan, and they've been in office for all of 24 hours and something goes wrong and it's suddenly their fault? Have you ever noticed that? It's because instant. It's like a lot of the Facebook posts about the mission to the moon. Well, why can't they get it right? Well, I'd rather them take the time to get it right than to blow something up. But that's not the way we think. If a company's profits aren't up this quarter, or maybe they're not up as much as they expected, and they go down, well, they're going broke, even though they probably made $2 trillion in the last quarter or something like that. We want it now. And God's saying, we'll wait until you're 75 and 65 to even call you to have children. Because we got all the time in the universe. I'm God. And then God does something amazing. God waits 25 years before he gives them the kids. 25 more years. Abraham is now 100 years old, and God's going, well, he was 99, and God says, next year you're going to have a kid. And Sarah's laughing and saying, yeah, right. And Isaac means laughter. And there was a bit of drama in the middle of that, and you had Ishmael and all of that, but that's for another story, for another day. I mean, it fits into this story, but we don't need it for what we're talking about today. And Isaac's born, and then Isaac is faithful to God, but kind of boring, so the Bible doesn't talk about him much, and so he has Jacob. He actually has two sons. He has Esau and Jacob. We're not doing very good on this, all the nations of the world blessed through your descendants, are we? Because we have two sons out of Abraham. One of them is rejected for the plan. And then we have two sons out of his son, so two grandsons. And one of them, Esau, is a hairy he-man kind of sort. And he's a few seconds older than Jacob, the mama's boy who is smooth-skinned and likes to cook and just a little too domestic for his father's tastes. And he likes his son to be strong and go out and hunt and do those kinds of things. And so Jacob's a bit of a disappointment to his father, and he likes Esau, who's a little older, but Esau's one of those dumb jock types. And so Esau, and they're smart jocks, don't get me wrong, but Esau sells his birthright to his brother, his younger brother, and ends up being cheated out of that through cunning and misdirection and manipulation, because Jacob is called Jacob because of the way that they were born. He was grabbing his brother's heel when he came out, and so they just labeled him a heel grabber, which also is a word that means deceiver and supplanter and manipulator and all of those kinds of things. It's not a very nice name. Can you imagine? Hey, heel grabber, it's time for dinner. Hey, manipulator, it's time for bed. Not particularly good. But again, we still see how God's operating in all of this. Remember, God wants to be known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob got in that list through deception, lying, cheating, and stealing. Is that how you'd want to be labeled, the God of the liar and the cheater? But God does. Because God's rescue plan is not the way I would do a rescue plan. It's probably not the way you would do a rescue plan. And so Jacob, he has this, he does a lot of deception. And when things get too difficult, he leaves and he does all of that. And then one day it's time for him to go back home. And so he's going back home, and he's a little nervous about that because of Esau, and Esau was going to kill him. And that would make you a little nervous to go back home where someone will kill you. And so he wants to go back to that. He knows it's time to go back. And Esau is on his way to greet him as he's on his way to go home. And he's very worried because he was told that Esau was coming with a bunch of guys with weapons. And so that makes him even more worried. So he divides up his group of people into various groups and sends them on and sends bribes. He sends bribes off to his brother so maybe he won't kill him. And he ends up alone. And in fact, over in Genesis chapter 32, verse 34, it tells us that he was alone. Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until daybreak. So Jacob here is left alone, and some dude shows up in the dark and picks a fight. One of those other weird stories of the Bible that we've been running into. And I'll tell you, the weird stories are usually the important ones. And so they wrestle. And it becomes evident to Jacob, and it's evident to us as we're reading the story pretty quickly, that this is not any normal individual. And I am, and many scholars are convinced that this is God in human form before Jesus, a pre-incarnate manifestation of God in human form. And he's wrestling with Jacob all night. And Jacob's wrestling with him. And he tries to throw him off, and he tries to throw him off, and he won't. All night. The sun starts to come up, and he won't let go. And eventually, the man who's wrestling with him, God, says, what's your name? Now remember, the last time that we know he was asked that, what's your name? He said Esau. Because he was stealing the blessing from his older brother Esau. And his father Isaac, he couldn't see, but he could smell and he could feel. And so Jacob dressed up and put skins on and dressed up in his brother's clothes so his father would be tricked into giving him the blessing, and it worked. But that's a deceiver act. And so this time, it's almost like a confession. I am Jacob. I am heel grabber. I am deceiver. I am supplanter, manipulator. It's a confession. And then the man says, no. Your name